For 11 years, I kept the trains running. Not literally. I'm not a railroad engineer. I'm a logistics coordinator, or I was, for a regional freight carrier based out of Columbus, Ohio. Mid-sized company, about 340 employees. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody. Where the guy in the break room heating up his leftover chili is the same guy who signs off on your PTO, where the CFO's wife drops off cookies at Christmas, and everyone pretends they didn't see her accidentally CC the whole company on a passive-aggressive email about parking spots. I liked it there. That's the part people don't expect me to say. I actually liked it. I came in at 29, fresh off a rough divorce and a cross-country move I hadn't fully thought through. The job wasn't glamorous. I was tracking freight movements, managing carrier relationships, troubleshooting the daily chaos that comes with moving physical goods across state lines when weather, fuel prices, and human beings are all working against you simultaneously. But I was good at it. And being good at something, really genuinely good at it, has its own quiet dignity. Over time, I became the person people called. Not because my title said to, not because someone put it in a policy manual, but because I knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically, and I knew which carriers were lying about their delay reports and which ones were honest and just unlucky. And I knew that the rate negotiation spreadsheet from 2019 had a formula error in column K that nobody had ever fixed and was slowly overcharging us on transloads. I knew things. I had built things quietly, steadily, over 11 years. And then my boss's nephew joined the company. His name was Derek, 26 years old, recently graduated from a school I won't name because honestly, it doesn't matter where you went to school if you show up to a logistics debrief asking which coast Miami is on. He came in with the title of Director of Carrier Strategy, which was a title that had not existed before he arrived and did not appear in any org chart I was ever shown. His first week, he asked me to explain what a lane was. His second week, he scheduled a meeting called Reimagining Our Freight Philosophy and presented 12 PowerPoint slides, 9 of which were stock photos of highways. His third week, he asked me in front of 4 other people whether I thought the company should pivot to more of a digital-first carrier model. I stared at him for a moment. I said I would need more context about what that meant. He said he'd circle back. So he never did. I went home that night and made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table and told myself it would be fine. He was the boss's nephew. He'd get bored, or he'd get promoted sideways, or he'd realize this wasn't the industry for him and go do something more suited to his skill set, like influencer content or whatever. What I did not account for was that Derek was not just bored and incompetent. He was bored, incompetent, and threatened. There is a specific type of person who walks into a room knowing nothing and still manages to feel like the smartest one there. Not because they're delusional exactly, but because they've learned that confidence in certain environments is indistinguishable from competence, and that the people who actually do the work are often too busy doing it to compete in the performance of it. Derek was that type. He started small, stopped inviting me to carrier calls I had run for years, started holding strategy sessions with the operations VP that he didn't loop me into, then implementing things we'd tried before, things that hadn't worked, things I had documentation on, without asking me. When the results were bad, he said the execution had been off. When the results were okay, he sent a company-wide email about innovation. I kept doing my job. I kept the trains running. I had built a carrier tracking system over the years. Nothing fancy, just a set of interconnected spreadsheets and automated reports that pulled data from our TMS, cleaned it, flagged anomalies, and generated the weekly performance summaries that the ops team used to make decisions. I had built it slowly, piece by piece, evenings and weekends, because the off-the-shelf reporting tools we had were useless and someone had to. Nobody had asked me to build it. Nobody had paid me extra to build it. I built it because it needed to exist, and I was the person who could see that it needed to exist. Everybody used it. Nobody talked about it. That's fine. I wasn't doing it for the credit. Then the annual review cycle came around. I had been expecting a promotion conversation. I had more than earned it. My manager had hinted at it for 2 cycles, and I had taken on significant additional scope after the previous logistics manager left and wasn't replaced. I went into that meeting feeling steadier than I had in a while. My manager looked at me across the desk and told me, with the expression of a man who'd rehearsed this, that the company was going in a new direction with the logistics function, that Derek's team was going to be consolidating some roles, that my position was being restructured. I asked what that meant. He said my last day would be in 3 weeks. I sat there for a moment. I looked at the framed photo of his kids on the desk. 2 boys, a fishing trip somewhere green. And I thought about 11 years. I thought about the formula error in column K. I thought about the time I stayed until 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in February because a snowstorm had stranded 14 of our trucks in Indiana, and I was the only one who had the direct line for the carrier's emergency dispatch. I said, okay. I signed the paperwork. I accepted the severance, 8 weeks, which was barely legal and frankly insulting, but I was too stunned to negotiate in that moment, and my brain was already running the numbers on how long I could cover rent. I walked back to my desk, sat down, opened my email, and started making a list. Not a list of things to pack, a list of everything I owned. Here is what people outside of office environments don't always understand. There's a difference between things a company owns and things that live inside one person's head. Proprietary data, official documents, licensed software, that's theirs, no question. But the knowledge of why something works the way it does, the institutional memory of which vendor will actually pick up the phone at 6 a.m. versus which one will let it ring, the specific workaround for the glitch in the TMS that only appeared when you were processing more than 40 loads in a single batch, the carrier contact list I had built over 11 years on my own time, in my own notes, that was mine. I spent my last 3 weeks doing exactly what they asked me to do, transitioning my work, documenting processes, attending handoff meetings. I was professional. I was thorough. I was not, however, going to hand over things I had never been asked to build. The tracking system, my spreadsheets, my automated reports, those lived on the company server, so I documented them and transferred them. What I did not document was the logic behind them. The data cleaning rules I'd figured out through trial and error. The way I'd set up the anomaly flags based on years of watching what actually correlated with delivery failures versus what was just noise. That logic lived in my head, and my head was going home in 3 weeks. I also didn't mention that 3 of the system's automated connections were authenticated through my personal email account, which I had set up years ago as a workaround when IT kept dropping the ball on service account access, and nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it properly. I'm not proud of that last part being a structural vulnerability. I am, however, not surprised that nobody thought to ask about it. My last day was a Thursday in March. I turned in my badge, said goodbye to the people I actually liked, my work friend Nadia in accounting, 2 of the warehouse guys who had always been straight with me, and I drove to the Greek place on 5th that does the really good spanakopita, and I ate lunch alone at a table by the window, and I let myself feel for about 40 minutes completely terrible. And then I went home and updated my resume. I was not watching what happened inside the building, but Nadia texted me. She texted me Friday afternoon, 3 words. It's already bad. I put my phone down and went for a walk. She texted again Saturday morning with a longer message. Apparently, the weekly carrier performance report hadn't generated. This was the report that ops use every Monday morning to make lane allocation decisions. It was supposed to pull automatically. It didn't. Someone had tried to run it manually and gotten a reference error. They'd called IT. IT had no idea what they were looking at. They tried to call the person who'd been assigned to take over my functions. He'd been with the company for 8 months and had never touched the system before. Nadia said Derek had been in the building until 9 on Friday night. I made dinner. I watched something mindless on TV. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. Monday, I had a phone screen with a company in Cincinnati. By Wednesday of that week, Nadia told me the carrier data had gone dark. Nobody could figure out why 3 of the automated connections had stopped authenticating. Someone in IT finally traced it back to the service account issue and found the personal email workaround, mine. And that was when the real scope of the problem started to become clear. The carriers weren't getting their automated check-in confirmations, which meant the loads weren't being tracked properly, which meant nobody could see in real time where their freight was, which meant the customer-facing tracking portal, the one that clients paid a premium for, was showing stale data. This is the part where I want to be clear. I did not sabotage anything. The system was working exactly as I had built it, within the constraints I had worked within for years. Constraints that existed because the company had never invested properly in the infrastructure. I had told my manager twice that the personal email authentication was a problem. Both times he said he'd flag it to IT. Both times nothing happened. I simply left. The call came 11 days after my last day. Not from my old manager, from someone in legal. She introduced herself, was very professional, explained that there were some transition challenges with systems I had managed, and asked if I would be willing to come in for a consultation. I said I might be open to that. I asked about compensation. There was a pause. I said I was currently consulting at a day rate of $2,000 with a 2-day minimum. Another pause. She said she'd need to discuss that with her team. I said, "Of course, take your time." She called back the next morning. I went in on a Tuesday. I wore the blazer I'd bought for interviews. I walked through the front door and used the visitor badge process like a perfectly ordinary outside consultant, which is what I was. Nadia caught my eye across the floor and did the smallest, most dignified fist pump I have ever seen in my life. I spent 2 days helping them understand the architecture of the system. Not fixing it, I made clear from the start that actually resolving the issues was beyond the scope of a 2-day engagement and would require either rehiring someone with full institutional knowledge or investing significantly in rebuilding the infrastructure properly. I answered their questions honestly. I told them what I knew. I did not perform bitterness. I did not gloat. I cashed the check on a Friday, then things got more complicated. I want to be careful here about what I share because some of it is still tied up in processes I can't fully discuss. But the short version is this. The freight company that employed me was a subsidiary, a relatively small subsidiary of a larger logistics holding group. And that holding group had been under investigation for about 18 months by a federal agency for practices related to carrier rate manipulation and misclassified independent contractor relationships. This was not something I had known much about when I was employed there. I knew there were some things that felt off. There had been a carrier billing situation a few years back that my manager had told me to document a specific way, and I had documented it that specific way because he was my manager and I didn't understand what I was looking at. I had kept those records. I don't entirely know why. Call it instinct. Call it the habit of a person who has learned over a long career that you keep things that feel important even when you can't articulate why. A few weeks after my consulting visit, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was an attorney, not the company's attorney, a different attorney. He said my name had come up in the course of an investigation. He asked if I'd be willing to speak with him. I said I'd have to call him back, and I called my own attorney first. What followed was several months of very careful, very boring, very legally significant conversations that I am not going to dramatize because honestly, it mostly felt like doing homework. Documents, depositions, calls I took from my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen that kept running out of ink. My attorney was excellent. I followed her advice exactly. The person at the center of the investigation was not Derek. Derek was peripheral, honestly, a symptom more than a cause, the kind of low-level chaos agent that larger dysfunctions tend to generate. The person at the center was the executive who ran the holding group. The man whose brother owned the freight company where I had worked for 11 years, whose brother was, of course, Derek's uncle. I testified in a deposition in November. It was in a conference room in downtown Columbus with very bad lighting and mediocre coffee, and my attorney sitting 2 feet to my left the entire time. I answered questions honestly and completely, and I did not editorialize. I was not angry. I was not performing anything. I just told them what I knew. The case is ongoing in some respects, so there's a limit to what I can say. What I can say is that the patterns I documented, the records I had kept, the specific carrier billing situation from a few years back, that information was useful. My attorney said I had been very helpful. The other attorneys seemed less pleased, which I consider a reasonable indicator that things were moving in the right direction. I got a job offer in January, new company, better title, and a salary that made me laugh out loud in a parking lot when the HR email came through. Not because it was funny, but because I was alone and I needed to put the feeling somewhere. The company is in Cleveland, which is 45 minutes from my apartment. I negotiated partial remote. They said yes immediately, which told me they actually wanted me there, which is still a thing I'm learning to expect. On my first day, my new manager, a woman who has been in logistics for 22 years, and has opinions about carrier scorecards that I fully agree with, walked me through the systems they used and then said, "We've heard a lot about what you built at your last company. We're hoping you'll help us do something similar here." I said I'd love to. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, same cup of tea, same window, different version of me sitting in front of it, and I thought about 11 years of quiet competence in a building where the loudest voice won, regardless of whether it knew anything. I thought about Nadia's fist pump. I thought about that deposition room with the bad lighting. I thought about the fact that Derek's career in carrier strategy had, from what I understood, not survived the reorganization that followed the investigation. That the director of carrier strategy title had been quietly retired. That the nephew had returned, apparently to pursuing other opportunities. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. Triumph feels like you've beaten someone, and I don't think of it that way. I felt something more like settled, like a thing that had been crooked for a long time had been put back where it belonged. The new company uses a TMS that's actually pretty good. The reporting infrastructure still has gaps, but nothing I haven't seen before. My manager gave me access to everything on day one and told me to tell her what I thought. I opened the system, found the anomaly in the batch processing threshold almost immediately, pulled up the settings menu, made a note. Then I made myself a cup of coffee and started learning the place. I don't think people talk enough about what it actually feels like to be competent in a system that doesn't reward competence. Not the anger part. Everybody talks about the anger. I mean the quieter thing underneath it. The way you learn over years to make yourself smaller so the people around you feel bigger. The way you stop volunteering what you know because you've noticed that knowing too much makes certain people uncomfortable. You tell yourself it's strategic. You tell yourself you're playing a long game, but somewhere along the way, the long game stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like disappearing. That's where I was when Derek walked through the door with his title that nobody had asked for and his slides full of stock photos of empty highways. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I was not perfect. I had built systems on workarounds because the company wouldn't invest in doing things properly, and I had let those workarounds become structural, and that was a failure, not of ethics, but of self-protection. I had made myself so indispensable that when I left, things broke, and the part of me that knew that, the part that had watched Derek stumble through carrier calls for months while my manager smiled and nodded, that part had made a quiet calculation. Not a malicious one, just an honest one. I was not going to hand over what I had built with my own time and my own mind to a man whose primary qualification was his last name. That's not sabotage. That's just knowing what belongs to you. What I've come to understand, sitting with this whole experience now on the other side of it, is that there is a kind of order built into the way things actually work. Not a cosmic order, nothing with a name, just the plain mechanical fact that systems depend on the people who understand them. You can shuffle titles around, you can install a nephew, you can restructure an org chart and call it innovation. But the freight still has to move. The data still has to be clean. The carriers still have to be managed by someone who knows which ones will pick up at 6 a.m. and which ones won't. Reality has a way of enforcing this. Not dramatically, not immediately, but eventually and completely. Derek's uncle built something on the assumption that relationships could substitute for expertise. They couldn't. The investigation wasn't about me. I was a footnote, a person who had kept notes out of habit and was willing to tell the truth about what she'd seen. But the pattern I had documented, the billing irregularities, the pressure to record things a certain way, that was real, and it had consequences because real things always do eventually. I think about Nadia's fist pump sometimes. I think about how she did it so small, so contained, like she'd been holding it in for a long time and didn't want to let too much of it out at once. That image means more to me than anything else from that whole period, because it wasn't about me winning something. It was about someone who had watched things be wrong for years, finally getting to see that wrong things don't hold forever. The thing I'd tell anyone in a version of that situation, sitting at a desk where your name isn't on the credit, but your fingerprints are on everything that works, is this. Know what you've built. Know what is yours. Do your job with integrity and document it carefully, and don't let anyone convince you that staying quiet is the same as being invisible. Quiet is a choice. Invisible is what other people try to make you. I chose quiet for 11 years. In the end, the quiet spoke for itself.